Welcome everybody to our WAN-IFRA webinar series. My name is Nicole Frankenhauser and I'm the advisory coordinator for WAN-IFRA's Global Advisory, the consulting division for WAN-IFRA based here in Frankfurt, Germany. On behalf of WAN-IFRA, I'm excited to bring today to the audience a webinar featuring our esteemed guest, Kevin Anderson, for the webinar, Publishers Meet the Chatbots, a new type of conversation with your audience. We invite our webinar audience to join us in the discussion. So once Kevin concludes his presentation, we will begin our Q&A session. To submit your questions, please find at the bottom right of your control panel a box that is labeled questions. Please type in your question at any point during the webinar, and after Kevin concludes his presentation, we will begin the Q&A round. A little bit more about Kevin. Kevin is the founder and principal of Ship's Wheel Media, a full-service media and communications consultancy, providing training, consulting, and content services for clients around the world. He has worked with Trinity Mirror, YLE in Finland, and the Eurovision Academy, the training division of the European Broadcasting Union. Kevin also works regularly with WAN-IFRA through our WAN-IFRA Training Academy, where he leads workshops for publishers from around the world. And don't forget to check out the Reuters report aligned with this webinar today. This digital news report, called Beyond the Article, Frontiers of Editorial and Commercial Innovation, explores not only chatbots and conversational interfaces, but also virtual reality and distributing your content on social platforms. I've listed Kevin's email here on the slide, so you can either get in touch with him or go to the Reuters Institute website directly to get access to this report. And don't miss out on our exciting upcoming WAN-IFRA events. First up, we have the Digital Media Europe event in Copenhagen, Denmark, next month in April, and we have our WAN-IFRA World News Media Congress in Durban this June. We hope to see you there. So for more information about these events, please visit the websites listed on your screen. And now, without further ado, I'd like to formally introduce Kevin Anderson, who will be presenting to you on chatbots and conversational interfaces today. Kevin, we're ready to hear from you, so take it away.
Thank you, Nicole. So let me just, there we go, share my screen. Seems. Thank you very much, Nicole. And let me just kind of frame the research a little bit. So beyond the article, when Rasmus Kleist Nielsen, of the research director for the Reuters Institute, contacted me, he was really keen to focus on digitally native innovations at news organizations. And that's why we used the lens of beyond the article. We wanted to look at news organizations that were really exploring things that broke the mold of traditional storytelling, and really focused on leading edge innovations as much as possible. So that was the first lens that we used, because obviously there's lots of innovative work going on at news organizations. Further to that, then I sort of focused on three general areas. So as Nicole said in the introduction, one of the areas that we looked at was highly distributed publishing. So this was news organizations that were really focused on distributing their content on social platforms almost exclusively. So there have obviously been some projects. AJ Plus would be one of them, but one of the projects we looked at was 140 journos in Turkey, and they distribute to 15 social platforms, including they had an experiment on Tinder, the dating app, to try to engage young Turks who don't normally engage with the news. The other lens we looked at, obviously, is what we're going to be talking about in this presentation, which is chatbots and conversational apps. And the third is visual journalism, and that includes VR, because I think that's one of the areas where we're really seeing an incredible amount of experimentation from news organizations. So that's how we kind of focused on the report a little bit, so we could dive as deeply as possible in the course of a short report. So some high-level observations that across the report, some things that we saw that were in common with the three areas that we looked at. all of the examples displayed some level of distributed content. So obviously, the initial part on organizations that were using social platforms both to distribute their news, but also as a way of crowdsourcing news and information. The conversational apps and the chatbots primarily that we saw were used on Facebook. So again, looking at those major platforms. And then Aaron Pillhofer, who until recently was the executive editor for digital at The Guardian, said that virtual reality and the fact that you're using a mix of apps, but also VR stores, so whether that's the Oculus store or Sony's PlayStation store or the Apple store, he said that VR could be, to quote him, the most distributed form of content we've ever seen. I think that another thing we saw was targeted engagement is becoming just as important as scale. So I think when you look at 2016, it was really the end of a period of development that news organizations were pursuing, where they were trying to grow audience as quickly as possible to pose some kind of challenge to the duopoly of Google and Facebook or other major social and search platforms that they faced. I think they've pivoted, seeing that scale strategy wasn't working, and that really it was about targeting an audience. And in a lot of cases, when you had news organizations that had a subscription model, thinking also about conversions. So bringing some kind of marketing focus, so that once they brought the audience to their websites, that they could then convert some of those people to subscribers, and also be much more effective in targeting their advertising to defined groups within their audience. Building on that, we saw a major shift beyond display advertising. So when Rasmus approached me about this article, I said to him, one of my favorite comments in conferences or clients is, if you don't have revenue, you don't have a product. And so Rasmus and I were very, very keen to make sure that we looked at the business models that supported these projects, which I'll do with each three of the examples that we've got here. And it probably doesn't come as any breaking news alert to anyone, but display advertising was not the business model that most of the organizations were pursuing. It was more native advertising, sponsored content, and those areas. And I think, lastly, for high-level observations, limited resources, no hindrance. I mean, going back to 140 journals in Turkey, they only have 10 employees. Rappler in the Philippines, which we'll talk about in this presentation, they're a digitally native news organization in the Philippines, and they they have a very lean staff. They have a CTO and a handful of developers. So we wanted to make sure that we highlighted some of the cutting edge innovations at large organizations like the New York Times, but we also wanted to look at those small startup lean organizations, just to demonstrate to people who might be skeptical about innovation that it didn't take global international resources to really play in this space and to be innovative. One of the key things that we looked at too was, how did the organization set priorities? Because I think when you look at some of the organizations that are starting to pivot, that are starting to achieve growth, that are starting to really take and change innovation into creating, keeping pace with digital audiences, into a real foundational building blocks of a new digitally led business, it was their ability to change priorities, to focus on priorities, and to execute on those new priorities. And this is all driven by changes, obviously, in user behavior. And one of the things that we looked at in the report was, what changes were they trying to adapt to? So some of the things that we saw, a lot of the news groups, most of the news groups reported a shift from open networks, so from Facebook, to more closed messaging networks. This was especially pronounced in Asia, but Finland, especially in younger demographics, which we'll explore in one of the examples, there was a pronounced shift from Facebook, in the under 24 demographic, to these closed messaging networks. So whether it's WeChat in Asia or Line in Asia or WhatsApp across many demographics, that was a huge shift that we saw. In some countries, such as the Philippines, they have seen a massive and sudden shift away from Twitter to Facebook. So Facebook, as their leaders at Rappler said, it fits into the way that Philippines are social and some of their social patterns, but also that Facebook has launched its these kind of subsidy projects where they're subsidizing access to Facebook with major mobile platforms. And in the Philippines, where more than 90% of Filipinos use pay-as-you-go, so non-contract mobile plans, that was a huge competitive advantage for Facebook as well. I think the other thing is when you look at this targeted engagement rather than scale, news organizations are really looking to maintain or build an unmediated direct relationship as much as possible with their audiences. So using a mix of newsletters, push notifications, ways to contact their users directly and not have to go through necessarily this third party, and also, as importantly, maintain ownership of that data about the activity of their audiences was becoming a very distinct priority we saw. So as I said, looking at newsletters and the lock screen. I think, lastly, content is increasingly visual. So across, again, I think all of the examples, you're seeing incredible content creativity in terms of delivering visual forms of journalism. So that could be social video, Now This News, AJ Plus. I just came from a conference with the European Broadcasting Union, and all the broadcasters were creating videos that felt much more native to Facebook than they would to a traditional broadcast audience. So let's dive into the examples around chatbots and conversational interfaces. So I talked a little bit about Rappler, and they're a relatively well-known case in terms of a digitally native news organization. They operate out of the Philippines. They have experienced incredible growth. Their president said that because when they launched about 4 years ago, they used social platforms to connect with highly social, highly mobile Filipinos. They reached traffic levels in 1 year that took traditional news organizations in the Philippines 10 years to reach. So you can see, 10 million unique visitors, 40 million page views, some really exceptional growth. But they realized, again, as I said, Rappler was one of the examples that they had initially started their social focus with Twitter. And so if you look at their site, it's heavily couched around the terms of hashtags, which are much more native to Twitter than they are to Facebook. And they launched this chat bot. And again, it's a Facebook chat bot. And so just as you would do with any chat bot on Facebook, you say hi or hello, and then you're connected to that chat bot. And then they allow you to search any keyword on the chat bot, and they'll give you stories based on that topic. So in some ways, initially the first iteration, if you will, was really kind of a social search tool to allow people to get personalized content. And it was important that they did that both for their content, but also, as I said, they do a lot of crowdsourced reporting projects. So one of the initial areas that they really broke out and started to crowdsource reports on were around disaster reporting, and they've gotten support for that kind of activity, both from international organizations, but even after Typhoon Yolanda, they got support from the Filipino government. More recently, they're using the chat reporting to not only do reports of bribes, as you can see from this presentation, this slide, but they also do good governance. So it's not just, have you experienced corruption or a bribe, but you can also report positive interactions that you've had with your local government or with the national government. And then they've got a dashboard that they report all of the statistics on. And let's just talk about the motivations. So people, Gemma Bagayao Mendoza said, the head of content strategy said, people are really seeing a lopsided view of what they're serving for the public, and that's having an impact on the quality of discourse. She said the echo chambers are out there, and they're affecting how people react to situations and current events. Again, as I said before in the introduction, they want to maintain this direct access. They know that a huge percentage of their traffic is coming from Facebook, but they really want to maintain that direct connection as much as possible, even if they have to do it within the mediated platform of Facebook. So the strategic goals of the chatbot were they wanted to respond to this shift from Twitter to Facebook, especially for their crowdsourcing projects, like Not on My Watch, the corruption reporting project. They wanted to increase discovery of their content. So they found that simply sharing their content on Facebook was really leading to kind of a superficial level of discovery. And there are certain things that work well on social platforms, very emotive content, very identity-based content. Any social strategist will tell you that. But they really wanted people to be able to see and for the chatbot to surface the widest range of content to their readers. They wanted to also communicate their editorial priorities. One thing that Gemma said to me was the newsfeed is flat. So people see an article. There's no sense of the importance of the article. You can put a keyword and say breaking, or you can, things like that, but it really is flat. It doesn't give you the same kind of editorial priority that you have with the design of your own website or with push notifications. Furthermore, it wasn't just about the priorities. They also wanted to communicate the different types of content they produce. So news, comment, analysis. And they thought that was, again, getting lost in the news feed, that people were responding to an analysis piece or a comment piece as if it were news. And I think we've all seen in the comments of, on Facebook, when it's an analysis piece and people are accusing us maybe of bias, and well, it's actually an analysis or comment piece. It's not supposed to be straight news. And they felt with a chatbot that they could communicate those different types of content, the different ways that they produce content. And furthermore, they wanted to allow their crowdsourcing projects to still engage with people despite the shift to Twitter. So one of the things with Twitter is they've had to do a lot of roadshows and a lot of training with their audiences to help them understand what they were trying to do with Twitter. But because people are so accustomed to the interaction on Facebook, they've found that they don't have to do as much, as many of these roadshows and as much of kind of external engagement efforts with their audience face-to-face. They still do them, but they find that the audience really takes to these a little bit more naturally than they did when it was on Twitter. So they were able to, just going back to the development of this, they were able to put, their CTO said they used 2 internal developers per project. So 1 for the Rap Newsbot and 2 for the crowdsourcing project. And they were able to develop a very rudimentary chatbot in a couple of weeks. So their CTO nominally said that this was a really rapid way to develop the project. Now, the business model. The business model is really an extension of the business model that they launched with. And they launched, this business model has been around, for 3 or 4 years since the launch of Rappler. So it seems very common now to have a content marketing native advertising project. But this is really what they've been doing for several years now. Is they say that because of their expertise in social media, and also because of some of the proprietary data that services that they've developed to support their own growth, they use this as a way to be distinctive in the marketplace and say to brands that we can deliver something quite unique in the market. So from the very day, from their launch till now, they've been focused on this. On business innovation as much as the editorial innovation, because they saw that as a key to maintain their editorial independence. They launched with this native advertising strategy right out of the gate, and again, they leveraged the data expertise that they have in their editorial operations to offer a distinctive product to commercial brands and companies, both domestic brands, but also increasingly international brands, and their sort of their unique selling proposition, their USP, so to say, is that they've got this proprietary tool that they can measure not only the engagement on their site, but also how it's delivering social reach, and the social platforms that they are working with, how those social platforms are delivering a larger and more extended impact. So moving on from Rappler, we'll move to to Finland's and focus in on NYT. And NYT is the youth-focused section of Helsingin Sanomat. And Jussi Pulinen, who's the editor who oversees NYT and worked with this project, he's very colorful, and he describes NYT as the, and I quote, gateway drug for young people to develop this habit with the Helsingin Sanomat brand. And I think in a lot of the work that I'm looking at right now with news organizations, media companies around the world, I think what we're seeing, one of the key things that companies are trying to do is, again, to maintain this direct relationship, is to build a digital habit. One of the strategic challenge that Jussi found was, if you want to reach young people, Facebook is increasingly not the way to go, especially if you're talking about teens. So NYT, up until 2013, Jussi said, was really simply taking content from the NYT print product and putting it online. It wasn't a terribly sophisticated strategy. It was just kind of a shoveling content on the internet, and I think we've all seen that phase of development through content. But in 2013, they really decided to go digital first, or digitally native. They relaunched the website, and just like Rappler, they used social media to radically extend their reach and to rapidly build that audience. But within a year, so 2013, by the next year, 2014, they started to see this plateauing amongst this youth demographic when it came to using Facebook for reach. So young people, again, that top level observation, young people are not using Facebook to interact. They're using messaging platforms or sharing platforms like Snapchat. And one of the things they found was that 80% of their target demographic was using WhatsApp. So that seemed like a natural first choice for them. So they launched a WhatsApp experiment, and they developed some features around WhatsApp. They pushed their headlines. It was incredibly successful. So they launched this in 2014, and it's a relatively straightforward thing to do. They just they had a number, and they developed some broadcast lists. They didn't do any marketing. It was really in the context of an experiment. So they just published the number, and Jussi said, well, we thought we would get some early adopters, maybe some people who were curious. In 1 week, they had 3,000 people sign up. Within a few weeks, they had 5,000 people, and they really just had to cap it because there are no editorial tools for WhatsApp. Now, for WeChat in Asia, there are editorial tools. So Asian publishers, where WeChat, especially in Chinese-speaking populations, they have a competitive advantage because WeChat has noticed that publishers want to use their platform, and they have accommodated that, where WhatsApp hasn't really done much to help publishers. So Jussi, again, in his colorful way of putting it, said that it quickly became a manual labor hell. And he said that they were having to manage 20 separate broadcast lists and manually prune users that had fallen off or add users. And not only that, it felt a bit rickety, and furthermore, there wasn't a clear business model for this. So whereas they were reaching users, whereas the engagement rate was incredible, almost all of the traffic came from push notifications. The users were asking them questions about the news stories. They were asking them questions about, especially Helsinki. They did some social reporting experiments on it. They really didn't have, none of the users came to the site. So they looked at the headlines in the newsletter, and that was sufficient for them. It felt a bit rickety managing it, and also they didn't feel that they could put any type of commercial messages on the platform without breaking WhatsApp terms of service. So they were really in this awful position of being successful but not successful in the business, and also the amount of resource it was taking them to manage this was really getting challenging. Now, I think, you know, to their credit, and I think this is again shows some of the maturity of their product development process, they said, okay, it's not a total failure. I mean, we've got a highly engaged audience that fits solidly in our demographics. So what lessons can we learn, and how can we adapt the success that we've had in WhatsApp and bring that into a new format? So you see in the folks at Helsing and Sonomat worked with an external group. So unlike Rappler, which used internal development resources, they reached out to an external agency. UC said they worked through an agile development process, and they were able to produce a chat-based app in 3 months. So take a lot of the channels that you have in WhatsApp and that conversational editorial voice which they developed for the WhatsApp experiment, and develop an app around that, and you know, reach those readers that they weren't reaching through Facebook, and that were key to their target demographic. Now, so the results with the conversational app, the adoption was incredibly rapid. So just as they saw with WhatsApp, they had a really rapid adoption rate. They have about 20,000 to 30,000 downloads of the app, which is about 10 to 15% of their user base on their website. Users continue to interact. So the users would send messages back to the reporters, and they could use it as a social reporting tool. And so one example that UC said that they did was, there was a story floating around that young Finns weren't having sex as much. And they asked the users of their chat app, was this true? And he said they got some incredibly honest and authentic reporting based on the app and the relationship they built with the audience. Now that's the pluses. The minus is where they've had a lower engagement rate. Now that's based on the open rate of the push notifications. So whereas almost all of the engagement with their WhatsApp newsletter, or all the engagement with their WhatsApp newsletter came through push notifications, only about a third of the engagement on the app comes through those push notifications. And so they see that there's a different interaction mechanism there. They also feel like they've got kind of an upper limit to the growth on the app, because they feel like they're competing directly with WhatsApp. So, you know, there's been some pluses and minuses with it, but, you know, overall it's successful. You know, UC, this is directly quoting from a Medium post that UC has offered, and I've got a link to it here in the presentation. But these are, I'll just kind of go through these relatively quickly. Key to this, and I think this is really important, is having a distinctive editorial voice. So it's not just about the technology. As he says, people don't want to chat with an institution, not even if it slaps emojis on messaging. Having a distinctive form. So again, just as with every other editorial product that we have, they have certain features that people have come to develop this digital habit with. So daily digest in the mornings, they've got a daily comic, and he says, don't send out random headlines. Offering a service and building a community, which I kind of see as both of, kind of the same type of thing. You know, people are interacting with the staff. They're asking questions. If it scales up more, he says you might need some bot help, but you can't rely on bots alone, because then it sort of endangers this unique editorial voice that you want to have, which communicates an authenticity to their target youth audience. And lastly, he says, don't just do breaking news. No one wants a chat friend that just sends out wire flashes. So, I think that's another really key thing, that some of this is about the technology, but when you think about the editorial voice and how you position it, it's a different product. And it has a very different purpose, and you want to make sure that you're serving the needs of that community which you've built. Now, the great thing is by having their own app, they didn't suffer some of the problems of lacking a business model that they had with the WhatsApp experience. So they could have native ads, and that's really the main source of revenue for the app. And because of regulations in Finland, they have to have a separate branded channel for this, so that all of this is there. But he said, if it's interesting and engaging content, the users don't seem to mind. And one of the reasons why they decided to go native wasn't just again because it's a trend in advertising, but they also found that in their research that their young audience was the most sensitive to ads and were the highest users of ad blockers. Again, in terms of the native ad projects that they're doing, they also run some engaging contests. So one of the ones that they did was, take your own best Hunger Games selfie pose and post that, and the winners will receive tickets to the movie or whatever. So that's the pluses, and it is working. But he says, and I think everybody who's done native advertising has found this. It takes more effort to sell than traditional packages, but the sales team is beginning to add this into their pitches and say, look, if you want to reach a youth demographic, this is a really highly engaged audience that engages with these messages, engages with this content, and this is the expertise that we bring to it. So again, leveraging that digital leadership, just like Rappler is. So the last, the last example we'll look at is Quartz, and Quartz is a millennial-focused business, digital business publication created by Atlantic Media, which also owns The Atlantic, a 160-year-old magazine founded by intellectuals in New England. So you shouldn't, by any stretch, it doesn't feel like it should be digitally native. But about a decade ago now, they've really taken a step to relaunch and reposition their brand and diversify their brand, and that they are launching things like Quartz, which I would argue is like a startup within the context of a legacy news organization. And I think if you want to look at what kind of push notifications are really successful in getting attention, Quartz is doing some really exciting things. So if you look at this, it's it has a relatively standard news headline, but then they've moved into this format where then the plus one is kind of fun and interesting, and it keeps people in the app a bit more because they're looking for that. And so it has, scientists build a chain-smoking robot to study lung disease. Now, one of the things with Quartz was interesting is that they launched and they were really they were quite focused on saying, we are a mobile-focused publication. We know that mobile is not only the future, it is the present. So we are going to be focused on mobile. They launched with a responsive site, but they did not launch with an app. And again, when they launched 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, they said, people download apps, the engagement is very high initially, but then it falls off quite quickly, which I think a lot of people in the early age of apps and the race for apps, they've seen that kind of that fall off initially. However, in the intervening 4 years, push notifications have become so much larger of a part of how we consume media. Nick Newman, who's done quite a bit of research, excellent research for the Reuters Institute, has an entire report looking at the battle for the lock screen, and so they decided that initially the focus was on how do we get into this notification stream, how do we get into the lock screen. The lock screen, and they went through a lot of iterations, but one of the products that they were most inspired by didn't come from news. It was actually a conversational fitness training product called Lark, and so that led to the app that they have. The interaction model is really simple. They've got 4 types of push notifications. You choose as a user which one you want to read. And if you swipe left, you can choose any one of these 4. So important and interesting once or twice a day. News updates a few times daily, or when things when news demands it. The markets haiku is one of the funnier ones. That they do a haiku at the close of markets in New York, and some of this the head of the product said, well, it's really that we think that most of the time that market reports are projecting some kind of patterns on what is just noise, and so the market report kind of takes and makes fun of that. And then the really, really big news, that's the only one where they'll buzz your phone, and they only used that 3 times in 2016. Once for one of the major terrorist attacks, once for the result of the U.S. elections, and once when Prince died. So you can kind of see here just a little bit of an example of, here's one of their market haikus. It's a strange world. A company neuters dogs and sells M&Ms. And that's one of their market haikus. They use a lot of emojis, but also Giphies, a lot of GIFs, animated GIFs from Giphy. And the business model is really interesting. So when you open up the app, it will show you this in-stream advertising model. And again, they've got a very rigorous, formal product development process, and they looked at how they thought about how people engaged with the product, and they thought, okay, this is very much in-stream, in the moment. We don't want it to be interruptive, so they've got these in-stream ad experiences, which are very similar to the in-stream ad experiences that they have within their main site. And in terms of their business model, they're very much this kind of, if you go to the site, it looks, they have native advertising, in-stream advertising, and it has been quite successful. They just announced a week or two ago that after 4.5 years, that they have actually turned a profit, and they did $1 million in profit last year on 30 million in revenue. So they've been able to make this very successful in a short amount of time, and they're in growth mode. And I think one last thing I'll just end on is they are really acting as a startup. So they have recently, at the tail end of 2016, they've stopped doing a conference, which was a very, very high-end tech conference. It cost $1,500 US to attend. And they said, well, look, we were making some money, but it wasn't as much money as we were making with some of our other products. So we're going to close that down. And their point was, as a growing startup, we need to focus not just on growth, but on our highest growth opportunities. And one of the key things is not just deciding what you do, but what you stop doing. So that's the presentation, and I really look forward to your questions now.
Wow, thank you, Kevin, for a very interesting presentation. I found the shift in user behaviors especially interesting, as some social platforms are kind of going off trend. So it's interesting to hear that from you. We'll just jump right into questions. There was actually 2 very similar questions, so I'll go into that first. Concerning chat apps, we hear that there are some indications that there might be developments in WhatsApp when it comes to business use, data, app development, etc. Do you have any news on that?
Not that I've heard of, and I just was asked this question by a client this last week. So, I think there's an opportunity there, but I think this is obviously one way where if we as news organizations, if we as media organizations take a specific opportunity to WhatsApp and show them an opportunity, I think that's the point of engagement. I don't have any news on that. If it is rumors, I think that's where it stands right now. There's not anything in the public, and I haven't heard anything from my contacts at Facebook that's in the works. But I wouldn't be surprised, because I think after the U.S. elections last year, Facebook is definitely looking. Facebook owns WhatsApp. Yeah.
Yes.
And
they bought WhatsApp.
They bought WhatsApp
For a lot of money.
For a lot of money, and you can see what they're trying to do with Instagram to challenge Snapchat as well, and so I would say watch this space, and definitely that's something I'm keeping an eye on, but I haven't heard anything more than rumors right now.
Okay. Thank you for confirming that. Another chat apps question that was big for the audience is, in Quartz's app, are notifications personalized? No,
they're not. So they're personalized. The personalization model is very, very simple. So it really is, you choose any or all of the 4 notifications, but there's no data behind it. And it's really, it's a small team. It's about 6 to 8 people who work on it. A handful of people in the U.S., London, and Hong Kong, and also it's not done by any kind of super AI. The model that they used are basically, they said it's just how we talk about news with each other on our Slack channel. So I think that what I would say is this initial iteration was kind of a minimum viable product, if you will, which is very much in the model of Quartz itself as a startup, and maybe in the future there is some level of personalization. I will say this on the data side of it. I asked them, so one of the ways that the app works is that when you get a notification, you can either click if you want any more information about that notification, or you can click into the story that it relates to. And I asked them point blank, I said, are you collecting data on that and learning about the story mechanics and how people are interacting? And they said they were just in this. I did the interview with with them in November of last year. They were just starting to delve into that. So I think really this was, let's get this off the ground. Let's get into the notification stream. Let's make, again, that daily habit, and just a little bit of extra data on that. They said most of their users dip in, or their core users, let's say that was the actual quote. Their core users dip into the app a couple times during the day for 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, we have a very global audience. So there's someone asking if you know of any sub-Saharan projects or cases related to conversational interfaces or chatbots.
Oh, that's a good question. And we tried to reach into Africa. There's none that I know. Well, that's not true. So there's been a lot of, and I mean, some of this goes back to sort of even like SMS news services. So there were a couple of them. I haven't seen any apps, but I do know that there were, again, some sub-Saharan news organizations that were starting to play around with, again, some of the regional messaging platforms that are specific to sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of have they moved beyond that kind of experimental phase, I think some of, again, what's happened is that the shift in usage was so quick that they never got past the experimental phase. So if they know of any, I'd be more than interested to hear about it, because that's the one area where I would have liked to have gone into more detail was Africa, and especially sub-Saharan Africa. But we didn't. I don't know of any experiments down there. But it's what I would say to anyone in sub-Saharan Africa is, if they're usually the data about which messaging platform, whether it's one of the global players or whether it's a regional player, is pretty readily available. And when you look at what Helsing and Sanomat did, very kind of a stealth launch, if you will, of their WhatsApp newsletter. You can launch tomorrow, and it's really as much about the editorial voice as it is about the technological effort. And so building up that expertise with just engaging with the audience on that platform is probably an excellent first step. And then you can see if it justifies a larger investment. And one thing I would say, going back to Quartz, is I travel a lot internationally. Obviously, I'm an American. I do have a data plan that gives me 2G data. So relatively slow data in most countries around the world. It's a part of my plan, so I don't have to pay extra. And Quartz's app is one of the few apps or news services that works quite effectively. Now, as they've added more more animated GIFs or GIFs into it, I've seen it become a little bit more sluggish. But I would say that's another benefit in countries where a lot of users are either using pay-as-you-go data or slow networks, is that some of those conversational apps can be really lightweight and reach more deeply into their audience than kind of a big, full-blown, heavy multimedia app would.
Okay, interestingly enough, while you were talking, we had another audience member say that Radio Dabagna is sending news via WhatsApp in Sudan, and are in the process of developing a chatbot 9 Radio. So there we have a good case.
Yeah, and if you could send that to me, I'd be really grateful just to take a look at it. Because I think, again, WhatsApp is when you look at the decline in SMS use and the increase in WhatsApp or some of these other messaging platforms, it's a great place to have an experiment. I think the one caveat is the experience with Helsing and Sanomat. But if you start to develop the behavior on WhatsApp and then transition people into your own app, I think, it's a great model. It's a great example of how to develop that audience habit and then build on it.
Great. There's another editorial type question, so we'll get into that. Question from the audience: how do you define a voice for a newsroom on social media?
Well, I've been doing social projects for a long time. And when I first started doing it, I was at the BBC. And the way that I explained it, and so, Quartz says, well, it's how we talk about news on Slack to one another. The way that I always explained it when I was at the BBC is, it's the difference between doing a two-way on television and talking to news in the pub with your friends. And, when you do a two-way on TV, you have this voice of authority. And When you talk, because all journalists get asked questions by their friends and family about news, because we're seen as sort of, trusted sources. You don't stand up in the middle of a pub and deliver a TV two-way because you just sound like an idiot. So you do it in that conversational voice. And I would say Trinity Mir, who's one of my main clients, has an incredible example of someone who's able to sort of turn between that professional voice of authority and that conversational voice. So she, it's a reporter in one of their smaller papers in North Wales. And, she actually uses her own personal Facebook account. She does not have a page. And people in her coverage area just friend her. So they don't friend her professional presence. They friend her. So she sees everything that's going on in their lives. It's a really kind of one of her colleagues who actually ran her Facebook page while she was on maternity leave said, it was really kind of strange to see these people talking about, oh, my brother's going to jail this week, and some really quite personal information. But I saw it firsthand, and she walked into the office, and there had been an accident where somebody had lost control of their car at 2 a.m. and flipped their car over and taken out a garden wall, and that story they probably would have heard about later in the day from the police. She walked in, there were 2 messages in her Facebook Messenger about it. And then she was conversing with them, and she wasn't, asking them questions in a formal journalistic way. I mean, she was almost like the people who work at the counter in cafes in England. It's, oh, love, hey, do you have any pictures? And it was really conversational, and, hey, good morning, how are you doing? And she's like, and so she said, do you have any pictures? And boom, 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 15 pictures rolled in.
Wow.
And, if they would have sent out a photographer the next morning, all they would have seen is police tape and a couple of bricks from the garden wall. It all would have been tidied up. Here she is, and she's got these great pictures from the middle of the night with this car that's on its top, and, bricks strewn all across the road. And it's an incredible tool. So I would say having the ability, and this is one of those things where it's as much of a hiring project as it is a training project. In that I think you have to look for employees who are able to flip back and forth. And one thing I would be clear, and this isn't a self-serving thing just because I'm not a millennial, but I said it's not just millennials who can do this. I mean, there are many people in newsrooms that I've worked at. I've worked in The Guardian, and Roy Greenslade has a great way of changing between the posts that he writes on his blog and how he interacts with readers. So you can find people like this at any stage of their career. Some of the sports reporters are absolutely outstanding examples of being able to flip between that kind of color commentator mode in that more formal match report mode. So that's the way I would put it. It is the old news as conversation versus news as the voice of authority.
Sure, I like taking that friendly approach, especially via social. Yeah. One more question, since we're running out of time here. My question actually relates back to the chatbots. So, Kevin, what are some practical approaches to building this type of technology? What are roles and skills needed for publishers developing chatbots?
Well, I think one thing that is a couple of things. I think one is when you looked at all of these organizations and their ability to innovate, regardless of the scale at which they operated at. So whether they were the New York Times or whether they were 140 journos, they had some kind of product approach. And so one thing that, and I think most companies are doing this, is they could say with real specificity the data that they were using to make the strategic decisions that they were making. So, whether it was, Jussi in Finland saying 80% of our users in our target demographic are using WhatsApp. Boom, there's an opportunity. So that data is, and people who are able to turn that into either a product or actionable editorial insights are really important. So that's a skill. And it's one of the things that I do a lot with my client base, is helping them to take and turn data into editorial actions, or better yet, even products, and figure out which products they should focus on. The other step in terms of creating this formal process is product and/or project managers. So these are people who really, they're either in larger organizations, it's a product manager, and in a wider range of organizations, it's a project manager. So again, another example from the report that we didn't talk about because it was a VR example is El País has a production team, and that production team makes sure that they have the right resources for whatever project they're doing, whether it's newsletters or chatbots or VR. And so I think that having those skills to manage the projects, digital projects that you've got going on, it's an invisible role because it doesn't operate necessarily on the front lines of editorial, but it is absolutely essential. And I remember when I was at The Guardian, one of the things that really accelerated some of the change that I was trying to deliver was when a project manager was hired to help me interface more productively between editorial and our development teams. So I think that's the case. And then I think, lastly, and especially, when we're talking about this, and it just dovetails from the previous answer, is when you're thinking about some of these hiring situations, and I don't think this is an either or thing. I mean, the best journalists are able to, again, it's just you're speaking to a different audience. And I think any of us, when I worked at the BBC, I would have a different voice when I was on 5 Live versus the World Service versus World News. And so you've always had to take into those account the different contexts and the different audiences. So having journalists who are able to, deftly and authentically pivot between those different voices and different audiences, I think is a really key thing in hiring and sort of some of the skills that we need to build.
Okay, well, I have no doubts that we're just seeing the beginning of chatbots. So great. Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for this energizing webinar. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our audience for tuning in today. And later, I will be sending a takeaways email from the webinar along with the recording of our live presentation. So check that out in your email soon. And we hope to see you all next time for our WAN-IFRA webinar series. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.